Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review a Netflix movie called Unknown Origins. So, this is kind of a detective movie that ultimately kind of ties in comic book knowledge. We have this movie that, of course, is dubbed in English, and ultimately, we have a story about a very geeky, nerd like guy who otherwise just owns a comic book store that ultimately is having a father that is a detective that is close to retiring. And ultimately these two kind of are going about their usual days and just otherwise going into, like, the son ultimately realizes that there's stuff about his father's case that looks very familiar. Uh, Ultimately, kind of bringing up some comic books here and there that looks like, hey, this looks like just like this character. Hey, this character looks like just like this character. And so eventually, the they are actually like tying in via every single part of these crime scenes. They are starting to realize that comic book covers are being left in hidden portions of each crime scene. And so more and more they're starting to put the pieces together that, oh, okay, this must be a comic book killer. And eventually it leads them to having to push to have there be a real caped superhero and a villainous villain who is very deformed or disfigured or whatever at the end of the day. Um, it was a very interesting story. I really enjoyed it much more than I thought I would. And ultimately, I would probably recommend people going out of their way to kind of see this because ultimately it's a it's a crime story that involves comic books, and that's kind of a weird approach. And ultimately, I just liked it just because it seemed fairly unique to me, just because it kind of gave superhero vibes without completely 100% uh, having the right person be into the right role and this and that, towards like you definitely have the main character who eventually becomes a superhero instead of a very kick-ass way where you have like a nerd that ultimately decides to otherwise one day just become a superhero. Instead, you have it to where a person that does not like comic books at all or doesn't care for them ultimately dons a cape and cowl eventually to thwart some villain. So let's let's I think kind of quickly go into spoilers. Let's pause here for a second. All right. Spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So, ultimately, yeah, it's a very kind of quick description of this movie and then right into spoilers. Because ultimately, there's like, once you kind of get past the description, it's basically just like, okay, let's bring up what this movie is actually really legitimately about. So, we have it to where our very first victim is gray skinned and a extreme bodybuilder that seems to have consistently been doing numerous reps of on a uh, on a weightlifting machine. Ultimately, we we have it here to where we have a very veteran police detective that is ultimately just kind of on his last legs and just kind of eventually going to hand off this case to a younger detective. And so ultimately, the veteran detective goes home and doesn't really can't really figure out this case. And so ultimately, he is going to hang up his boots as a detective. He has his boss kind of makes him sign his release papers, and eventually he just like calls it quits. So all the while we basically have um, the boss of all the detectives. She is evidently a cosplayer. She consistently comes in Sailor Moon outfits and like Miss Marvel or Captain Marvel kind of outfits or Miss Marvel kind of outfits. Consistently just all kinds of cosplay and this and that. Eventually, we also get to a person, like I said, who is a comic book geek and ultimately all the time wears comic book shirts. The guy kind of comes to dinner in superhero like shirts, and ultimately his father's like, "Isn't it a little late to be wearing pajamas?" And he's like, "No, this is just like a superhero shirt." He's like, "Oh, I thought those were pajamas." And so ultimately, after eating some dinner or whatever, they like the father and son end up just kind of going into a room where ultimately he's kind of seeing this case file of the last case that his father was working on. He mentions it's like, hey, this looks like the Hulk. Like this character has gray skin and everything like that. Sure, fair enough. They go back into the crime scene and they find the Incredible Hulk #1 uh, comic book cover, but it's kind of torn in half. Because, of course, I think they were trying to avoid like certain kind of comic book images so that way they wouldn't have to spend a ton of money on having to use these kind of resources and this and that. So ultimately, there is another character that is dressed in a kind of very armored, like put together outfit, and he is ultimately being like having his life in the balance with his heart. Basically, we have a Iron Man situation. And basically, the comic book geek again calls this out, and eventually they find out that there is a Iron Man comic book cover via this crime scene. So, if anything, they're noticing it's a comic book killer, and they're ultimately realizing that it seems like this nerdy kid of all that knows all these comic books. It seems like he is the only one that can solve all of this. So ultimately, the detective, of course, that is working this case now, he doesn't know about comic books, and so ultimately the veteran police officer is mentioning, like, hey, like, you need to talk to my son, you need to, like, work with him and this and that. And the kind of boss detective who cosplays a lot gives into this because she's like, yeah, I think this as well. Even though she doesn't read comic books, she only cosplays. So she goes in, or we go into this, and this cop really wants nothing to do with comic books, but he forcibly has to read them because it's involving in this case. Like, he hates superheroes because ultimately he he sees them as in, like, a lot of people rely too much on superheroes, and like everybody wants to be kind of like saved and this and that, and like, what if there is no one there to save them? Because ultimately in the very beginning of this uh, movie, we have it to where it seems like people die or fail or get hurt or whatever. So it's like, yeah, we the more and more we get to figure out these two cases, and then eventually we are getting into like trying to realize that they are starting to have even more cases that are even uh, starting to spurn up involving radioactive, like, material. They find out that there is radioactive stuff mixed into um, certain people's like bodies, and then they go, oh well, hey, if this is radioactive, then realistically, like, this case is going to transition to someone else, because ultimately, like, yeah, that's usually what this usually gets called for, is immediately once. So ultimately we have a coroner who is ultimately telling them, hey, like, well, I want us to solve this. I don't want some other police department to solve this, so I will kind of uh, misplace this in the paperwork, so that way it'll keep this case here. So we go into having cases that are similar to Spider-Man and then eventually X-Men. Very much involving radioactivity, getting to the point where uh, everyone in the comic book store are all going to have like punch and stuff like that. The punch is poisoned, and people start dropping like flies. So we we have a villain in this story, and this villain eventually grabs the veteran detective, because we find out that this veteran detective is dying of uncurable cancer, and so ultimately, like, he's going to be like our Uncle Ben in some ways or another, if basically we haven't had to, for the hero of this story, killed off several one of his loved ones already, uh, killing his family, and at points his, like, yeah, all of his loved ones. So going into this movie, we have it to where we find out who this killer is, and we find out that it's none other than the coroner. And I'm like, okay, that doesn't strike me as like a ooh wow crazy cool reveal. But if anything, I guess it really doesn't really matter who the villain really was, as long as it's just an exciting movie. So the coroner wants his detective to not be a detective. He wants the detective to be a superhero. He wants them he wants him to dress in superhero garb and this and that. And so ultimately the kind of the nerdy kid ultimately goes to the detective and says, "Hey, like I'll give you this like outfit stuff that you can wear." And like it was the same stuff that my brother wore. So puts all this on and then eventually goes in to fight the villain. And eventually it gets to the aspect of the coroner eventually kills the veteran detective, and then eventually hero and villain fight it out. And basically like the hero gets basically off to like falling off to the side and otherwise holding on to the very edge of this precipice to be dumped into seemingly some toxic waste. Because ultimately, right before this guy had put acid into his face to ultimately be disfigured, to put on this very much old plague doctor mask of sorts. Um, yeah. So this guy's teetering on this end, and he was like, "Oh well, like you should help me, right? Like you're the good guy." And he's kind of like, "Well, hey, it's like I don't see a good guy here. I see Vortex or whatever, or Vertex." And so eventually the guy falls over into the vat of toxic waste, and then he dies. In the midst of this, we eventually have a damsel in distress, or a damsel in distress, a damsel in love, I guess, with the detective slowly but surely falling for his own boss. He eventually, um, the more and more he starts talking with his boss, the more and more he's starting to fall for her, and eventually kisses her, which I thought was kind of cool. That was like, oh, okay, so I guess these two were just bizarrely like meant to just be more than just boss and an employee. They were meant to be lovers, I guess. So yeah, and yeah, it was kind of really cool to ultimately see that the nerdy kid ultimately kind of really like there was a whole backstory about the nerdy kid where his brother uh would ultimately torture him and basically like call him like a fat sack of crap or whatever, because ultimately like a lot of the kids would tease him and he would have to be like protected by his brother, and then his brother would give him noogies because ultimately, or him just kind of like scolded because like, hey, I had to protect you. Like you should be just a better person, and this and that. And ultimately, like detective, like didn't really ever have anybody, and like so that's like the kind of it gets to the point though where eventually the detective and the nerdy boy are eventually just kind of become good friends just because ultimately like they don't really have anyone else. So yeah, kind of like at the end of it all just kind of putting friendship forth into this review. But yeah, kind of a much simpler story to talk about, kind of a very much simpler story to get into, and probably a much quicker review just because there's just a couple things here and there to kind of mention. And in the end, this movie won me over, and it was a very, it was very simple. And yeah, at a lot of points, it was just a fun film to go into and just be like, oh, okay, so I was kind of confused because I was like, okay, what is about like the comic book stuff? I'm a little confused. But then ultimately, when I go into this, I'm like, oh, so they're using comic books as a like fulcrum or whatever, to like it's a detective movie, but then it changes into a quasi comic book thing because that is the thing that it needs to get into. All the while, we eventually have like cosplay and comic book store and like a like it's kind of interesting to see the detective who basically is kind of like making like the bare bones minimum of money compared to people in a comic book store that are very rich, and they're showing pictures of, or the people in the comic book store just showcasing pictures of like, oh hey, do you have like this kind of car? And like this guy is like driving like the Batmobile or whatever, and he's like, yeah, I bet you don't have this car. Like, you got a lot of people that are ultimately all in this comic book store, and they're all like rich misers, and they all have like tons and tons of money, and you just have this detective that is just kind of like, well, yeah, I guess really we have escalated to a different kind of society where a lot of this stuff is much more accepted and this and that, and if anything, like they're like making fun of me just because I'm not at the same level of life as they are in. So yeah, it's just a, and then you have to like force somebody that isn't interested in comic books to forcibly start reading this stuff, and eventually it was kind of cool to eventually finally say the uh when the detective's boss is calling him and mentioning, like he's mentioning that he has to go and like kind of take down this villain. She's like, well, like you better come back alive because I love you. And then he says like, I know. And then she's like, dude, you did the Han Solo Star Wars thing, and you didn't even know that you that you did the Han Solo Star Wars thing. It's like, God, what a guy that you are. You didn't even realize that you were doing something geeky or nerdy. You just kind of just did it just to do it. Um, but yeah, I really liked the fact that once this detective really had to go into this comic book store forcibly for the first time, the the comic book store clerk had to basically give him a ton of origin story like books. He had to like give him a bunch of like, oh hey, here's a bunch of like famous comic book characters and their origin stories, because ultimately I'm assuming that if the killer is gonna keep doing this, here's probably some issues that they're gonna do next. And then he realizes like how expensive they are, and it's like, well, like yeah, I had to make sure that you had like enough like resources to be able to figure out if these next cases come up. So yeah, just kind of me just talking overall about the story, and like once I kind of like spilled about all of the approaches of which this goes into, like after that it was just like, okay, like because ultimately it's either you're gonna like this right away, like right out of the bat, or you're not gonna care for it. So I don't know. I think that's basically why I didn't have much for this review in a very cryptic like sense. And then also, I just kind of wanted to just kind of bash this out there. So, without a doubt, I think I'm going to get out and finish my uploading days. So, goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.